Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in June 2024. Continuing on the theme of Gen AI, we now have some amazing experts and long-time contributors to the summit. We're going to talk about the micro, mid-range, and macro sort of risks of how Gen AI risks break us all. And it's going to be a very interesting session. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me or accepting me on again, Dennis. Yeah, I wrote these other two in, Nick Drage and Mitch Cohen in because I wanted to talk from the point of view of the kind of teams that the pitches for Gen AI use and LLM and LMM use we're going to land on, which is not largely going to be AI specialists. It's going to be people who are populating small, medium, and large size businesses and doing the usual efforts at due diligence in the time available, unpicking the vendor pitch versus the sort of problem space that you're occupying, unpicking the problem space if one hasn't been identified, and it's just a where can you use AI versus putting somebody in to solve an actual problem where AI looks like a good fit in the first place. So, I mean, that I think that talks to some of the challenges that we've got about framing and positioning this. So what I'm going to do first, just housekeeping wise, I'm going to share all the slides that I share, which are only going to be a 3 or 4 from my point of view. I'm going to add them all together and send them in to be shared via the site afterwards. And if we reference things that are of interest to people, I'm going to try and keep a note of those and put those on a resources slide at the end as well. But please don't expect us to get into the weeds of the technology. What we're trying to do is explore the risk space, talk about which security directions we're suggesting we focus on, but trying to break that down in a little bit more manageable way because there's a lot of overwhelm, I think, and that's really where we're coming from today. So without further ado, let's get that up. So I didn't want to do an about us slide. Just for those who haven't met me, I'll do just 1 minute on me, which is a background about 20 years since I started in IT, 15 years since I started doing some governance stuff. I did about 10 years flat cybersecurity, in-house, out-house, server and floors, desktops, networks, doing a bit of SCADA separation work. So I've been sort of from tin to wires. I haven't really done security research, unlike other people on the call. And I moved through that into data protection and then into sort of novel technology and looking at the edges of where AI governance lives. I did a couple of years with an organization who were looking at AI audit criteria development, and I now work in my spare time with the World Ethical Data Foundation on things they're doing, one of which is around an open standard for responsible AI. So that's how I arrived here. And this slide really busy. This is what represents about 3 years thinking about how we could break this down. And I just kept coming back to the fact, and this has prompted a lot of the thinking, that we can't even start until we understand the context in which we're going to use the technology. And a lot of the standards at the point where I put this together were still focused on how can we attach some controls to principles, trustworthiness, accountability, fairness, transparency. And the slight feeling of desperation that was creeping in was, how the heck do I operationalize that? How do I actually test something? And then it started to be met with, coming from the other direction, from some quite technical guidance from organizations like the IEEE. We've got vendors pulling us up from the bottom up with a lot of quite explicit kicking of the tires of bias within code. Have we matched the ground truth to the target population proportionally? Have we looked at the risks of prompt injection or model poisoning? Have we looked at potential for model drift? Those kind of technical things were coming from the other direction. But what it led me to consider was, why am I getting so overwhelmed? Why am I struggling to work out where to start? And to me, it felt like people were confusing what I'm calling, for this purpose of this talk, the micro, which is the me context. What does it mean for my current knowledge? How do I upskill? Where am I going from and to in terms of knowledge? How's it going to affect my career? How do I transform what I know and what I do to match what the future might look like? how do I advise my kids about using it? How do I stop them getting accused of cheating while taking advantage of some of the potential of AI? And what am I advising my older family members who haven't got a clue what's going on? And but at the same time are likely going to be impacted by it in terms of things like chatbots they're going to encounter, customer service interactions, that kind of thing. And then the mid-range is more the day job. Where do I start? Where do we start? What list of controls, if that's the direction you go? How do you do risk identification? And then at the macro level, it's really what's happening in the industry. Are we in a bubble with Gen AI? What other types of AI have we forgotten about while we're so preoccupied with OpenAI, Mageddon? And what's next? How do we prepare and be responsible in terms of the communications that we have with potential clients and peers about the part that this will play? So it's that micro, mid-range, macro, and that was reflected in a whole bunch of things. So this is a model I put together to try and unpick my head about this. So looking at the some of the stages in AI life cycle, and then looking at more traditional audit scope in the blue section there, that's a certain amount of controls can only be answered when you're acquiring and preparing data. Things like, did you get consent for that? Are you breaching any copyright with that? Those kind of things can only be operated in. The answers to those things kind of reside at that level. Really, model monitoring is the first time that you can prove whether you did sufficient bias remediation with your model preparation. And then in the orange section of the scope, it's really looking at the very technical tire kicking, those things that you need specialist skills, data science and ML ops kind of skills to tackle. So that's the way that I started to think about it. And funnily enough, it doesn't look a million miles away from how NVIDIA have described their red teaming, the way they've sectioned that off. The green, orange and blue seems to be the colours that everybody's chosen for a whole bunch of this stuff. And so that starts at the GRC level, sort of my world nominally, and then moves into the methodologies and techniques level, and then moves into the tooling and down to the cloud stack for the different stages of the AI life cycle. There's a link there. This is back from June 2023. And I think there's been a little bit of teeth gritting in the security community about the use of the term red teaming in this context, because traditionally we've all scoped pen tests and we've all understood what the edges of that more standardized operation is. Red teaming evolved to be a risk and threat identification and modeling activity to replicate the performance of an attacker, trying the windows, trying the doors, seeing where you could find a gap to squeeze yourself through, having agreed the scope of how destructive or not you were allowed to be, just like a pen test, hopefully. And I'm going to leave it to the other guys here to explain that in more detail. But we now have concepts like legal red teaming for AI and things like bias bug bounties. Now, there's an awful lot of terms being used, the edges of which aren't going to get refined until later. And I do have to wonder whether a lot of this is post hoc trying to mop up what has not been designed for in terms of control. And really just highlighting, and again, I'll share these slides. This is very busy again, but it's just highlighting that pretty much all of the laws and regulations that are coming through have the same kind of model of a baseline consideration of where controls might apply and where threats might apply and where vulnerabilities might exist, a mid-range and a top level of scoping that you have to consider. And something that's come into the conversations so far is there seems to be a little bit of cynical crossing over between the macro of existential risk, for instance, and the mid-range of what businesses will deal with, or the macro of is AGI happening tomorrow, and the mid-range of the conversations you need to have with your peers and colleagues. So that is literally all I was going to share at the moment, but this plus any other resources will be shared later. And I'm now just going to hand it out
Sorry, Sarah, I had a
to the other
question.
folk here.
Could you share the screen again? I had a question on that one.
this one.
No, that maturity model that you have there, 2 slides before, right?
Oh, okay, 2 slides
Of how you
before.
measure the models, right? This one here, right? And I think this is very important because, we were talking before, like I'm in a position where I almost like I want my models to be read-only, and I want to know at least amount of content, so I bring my own content. So in a way, I'm getting more and more interested in understanding this for the models that I use. Now, have you done this, or has anybody done these analysis to the popular models that we have now?
This is my way of breaking it down. So I've done it nominally, working with a couple of clients, one of whom was using it happened to be OpenAI, but they were going to have a small language model that they were going to build as bespoke moving forward. And we apportioned a decent subset of the commonly prevailing controls into each of these pots, and then got a quick and dirty view of can you answer this question or not? And for some of them, we just put that we can't answer this question straight away.
Yeah, but that's
it
fine.
went into the top level of uncertainty just to park it.
Yeah.
And then we answered, okay, can you dig into this if I ask you to? So there was a bunch of stuff that was yes. And it was quite an interesting heat map. And I think what always happens is we had a whole bunch of a highest level of uncertainty or confirmed non-compliance around data provenance and copyright.
Well, I think each of these needs a massive zoom, but I think that even if you just start with this high level, and I really like the sort of the way you're breaking down from the life cycle of how you do it to the assessment to then the technical thing. If you think about it, every model that gets published should answer these questions, right? And even if it's unknown, that's fine, right? Like it could be that.
Well, locating your uncertainty and understanding the degree of it, where it lives in your estate, is better than just placing a bet and not being able to cover it, which is what a lot of people are doing at the moment.
I think this is super cool because I think we're in a world now where there's lots of models that exist, and you almost want the models that are doing it right to almost, have a competitive advantage, right? So let's say there's a model at the moment that might not be very popular, but on this one, almost, checks most of the boxes, right? Why, we need a way to make that model to be more popular.
But there's another thing going on here as well, Dennis. If we are operating in the model deployment or model monitoring space, and there's absolutely nothing we can contractually magic up in terms of capability for those downstream suppliers, then it's actually fair to apportion the degree of uncertainty we're going live to the people in the supply chain to whom it belongs. So there's a liability demarcation element to this as well in terms of third-party governance, and we don't really deal with uncertainty very well in governance at the moment. We're asked to offer an opinion on risk even if we haven't got any information, and I think when we're operating in a space where not even the people designing the models understand why they behave some ways and don't behave others, it's absolutely fair that uncertainty should be front and center as an element of your reporting.
But
we can't know this right now. We won't know this for a while.
But you are bringing certainty, right? What I like about this is, this is the beginning of very objective questions, right? Like, do you know how you acquired the data? Do you know how you train it? Do you know how you evaluate it? Do you have ways to monitor, right? I think these are become very objective questions that, you want people to go, yes, no, right? Again, we can then argue what's the definition of compliant, non-compliant. But I think that what I also like about this is that this should make a lot of people that want to develop their own models to think twice, because they go, hold on, I'm going to have to match this bar, right, of quality or this bar of visibility. And if I just go and develop my own model, I can't do that. So
yeah, I mean, what are you bringing in? What do you need to do going forward? And also that scoping piece for which red lines might exist, but really being able to put some shape around your risk exposure that's rational rather than just is it trustworthy?
Cool.
We need to get a lot further than that.
Yeah, I just thought when I saw this, I was like, cool, now can I get this map to 10 different models? that the most popular ones, right? And easiest CEO unknowns. I don't
Yeah,
think
I mean, anybody who wants to spend time and pay me to come and do this for their estate, then please do feel free. The more time the tires get kicked for this, and I can locate, I can map more rational control sets to more model types into more of these pots individually, the happier I'll be, and the more I can share with folks. So, but yeah, so just to sort of bring the other guys in here, because it's the first time I've ever organised a panel and invited other people to join me. So I really want to give them a chance to say something, because first of all, I'm really delighted you've made time for me, Mitch, Nick. But I mean, I was just going to follow that macro, mid-range, micro view of the world for you, and ask you, first of all, based on that day job perspective, I think it's a more readily accessible thing. What's your feeling about priorities and the kind of conversations you're having around security and risk exposure and what to do first? And the rider for that is, how are you feeling about the idea of red teaming being kind of one of the primary recommendations to cover off security in some places? I was going to go to you first, Mitch, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So just going to do a quick introduction just of myself real quick. So my name is Mitch. I'm a senior cybersecurity and dark web research analyst with VARS, which is a division of Grant Thornton. And additionally, I also work with Sarah as a cyber threat intelligence analyst with the World Ethical Data Foundation. I'm a big believer in helping people, which is why I wake up every day and put on my clothes and get ready to help as many people as I can. Specifically in the area that you're bringing up, which is the red teaming, there are a few clarifications that I usually make with clients when it comes to Gen AI and how it's going to impact cybersecurity. So those clarifications, which really do fall in that range of micro, mid-range, macro, is we start off with the individual people. A lot of the work I see on the dark web, a lot of the ransom companies that I'm exposed to, they fall into this category that a lot of cybersecurity people know, which is that the biggest threat to your company sits between the chair and the keyboard. Social engineering is still a very large part of what happens when a company gets breached or attacked. So Gen AI is going to impact at a micro level the individual people of an organization, which is one of those things that used to be really easy to spot. I'm sure we've all gotten those emails that are not your native language, that have a bunch of spelling and grammatical and syntax errors, and you're like, this probably doesn't seem legitimate. And that's how you know not to click those links and do those things. But Gen AI has really come in as a larger risk that people can now generate those emails that are written at almost university, college, academic level ways that is tricking more and more people every single day. So when we talk about red teaming and the social engineering aspect of that, that's a big risk that comes into play. Additionally, a lot of companies are worried about, how is Gen AI going to attack my technical infrastructure? Early on, when ChatGPT first came out on the dark web for sale, there was WormGPT, which was a true cybersecurity pen testing way of attacking infrastructures directly through generative AI models that are writing their own code, writing their own ransomware, and attacking the technical infrastructure. So one of the ways that we talk to clients at a direct level about this is ensuring that their technology stack is A, up to date, and also informing their teams of what they need to do to protect against these types of things. And this includes detection response systems that are put into place and a lot of different technical areas to fight technology with technology. That's what we're really seeing and recommending to people, is that generative AI is going to allow for a level of scalability of attackers against technical systems. And that scalability of hitting all of these different things at once is what we're really looking to protect on that front. And then additionally, we have a few clients who are building Gen AI models, and they're looking at how can we protect the model ourselves? How can we ensure that someone can't do a prompt injection, someone can't have data leakage from our model that was supposed to be closed off, and how can we really protect that? One of the things that we talk about is that the established practices within your organization around your Gen AI models become the policies that exist with that, because ultimately it's people who are building this, and that's what we're doing. It's ultimately a chief information security officer, a CISO's job, not to make sure and lock it all down and do it. It's really to observe everything and provide guidance to the business to make sure that those generative AI models are protected in a way that people can't abuse them to increase the greater risk of governance charges, threats to people, and everything along that front. So when it comes to the client conversations I'm specifically having with the team, it's really within those three categories because Gen AI is this large umbrella of everything we see every single day.
That's really good stuff. Thank you, Mitch. I think there's I think back to other engagements in big businesses where I've got whole security teams around me, and I was trying to work through how this is going to affect all of their day jobs, and that amplification point really hits home. Is that while I'm looking at amazing things that people like Matthew Adams are doing with creating with AttackGen, he's using MITRE ATT&CK framework to conjure up incident scenarios for teams to take away around attacker and exploit pairs, and getting a natural language starting point to do incident scenarios. So we've got different types of stuff that's not Gen AI, obviously, that's helping with things like filtering through all your different panes of glass to kind of surface something a little bit more easily and meaningfully in your SOC. But I would, with yourself, Nick, I know that you're very concerned with helping people navigate strategy a little bit more nimbly, that whole overwhelm piece. But I'm really interested in your perspective on this as well.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, firstly, sort of everything you both said to agree with, as I was saying in the preamble before we started, is just great points well made already on sort of telling customers what to think. The main, just looking at my notes, the main thing I'd start with any customer is asking either what are you going to do. So because I think the questions are really context specific, and you just iterate from what they're doing, or actually what have you done. So it's sort of, you've raced ahead with this because everybody else seems to be doing it as well. So you feel like you've got to do it regardless of risks and so on. It's like, well, we can't miss out. So it's getting organizations to answer those questions, or whichever version of that question is appropriate, and then iterating from there. But specifically to the question you just asked me, is what is your strategy? Is it overt or covert, say, or is it sort of explicit or implied? Do you have an explicit strategy of, we are going to implement AI first, do risk assessments as we implement it, and we believe we can handle the risk? Or are you going to be slower than everyone else, learn from other people's mistakes, like just read the headlines and see, no, this is not a good chatbot yet, no, it should not be making sort of legal decisions, say in the case of New York City, pricing decisions in the case of whatever that poor car vendor was in the US, or the was it Delta Airlines with the plane, all those sorts of things. Are you going to consciously take a step back and learn from others' mistakes, but to make that an explicit strategy and be mindful of what triggers make you change your mind? If you see yourself falling too far behind, are you going to start abandoning some of the risk decisions you make? Or if you see that other companies are making mistakes and making headlines, do you know how you're going to wind it back? And getting customers to think about those decisions and the consequence of those decisions through a war game methodology, get them to actually play them through. So you've decided to do this. Let's imagine that has happened. Let's imagine these are the consequences. That changes the state of the war game we're playing. Now, what do you do next? And you don't sort of discuss it generally. You put them in that position and say, make a decision. You've got 15 minutes, then the game will move on. And it makes everything more realistic, and means that headlines happen in a game rather than headlines are on the literal newspapers and on the literal sort of BBC website saying, don't be a warning to others.
Don't be a cautionary tale.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so, I mean, again, thinking about that, is that happening so often it kind of doesn't matter, or everybody's excited about the technology, so it's okay? Or so, like you've shown with your excellent sort of grid, is the Clarke Gen I compliance matrix, I think it should be called, though, and maybe need to think about the acronym and see what it clashes with, is think through that and war game it, play it, and be prepared for the consequences rather than you just become that warning for other organizations. And there's existential risks here, both through going too fast and going too slow. Think more, I think is sort of the summary of my advice to organizations.
I like that. Thinking twice is never a bad thing. Well, sometimes a bad thing. It depends the scenario you're in. I mean,
yeah.
if you can't constantly be crisis managing, and I think that's what it feels to most of us like at the moment. At some stage, you need to pause. There's been a massive blitz effort on scaling and obtaining market share, and I think we're all just trying to draw breath a bit off the back of that and working out how much we're going to be dealing with moving forward. So I really like that perspective. I did have one scenario that came to me secondhand, which is people looking at a chatbot to support with mental health triage. It wasn't breaching clinical thresholds necessarily for needing either US or EU medical software as a medical device kind of assurance. It was more in a kind of charity service context, but things had gone very, very fast in terms of trying to get this in for a very, very good reason, which is that people were very happy talking to the models because they were a very logical response that people didn't feel like was judging them. And it was very intuitive to have an exchange. But in terms of governance and building the user interface and building the back end to be stable, there was an element of, if people depend on this, it has to stay up, it has to be there. You have to be able to respond to a crisis in the moment. You have to have enough warm bodies who can respond to text or email or by voice. If somebody has a crisis in that moment, you have to know who your referral mechanisms are. You have to consider liability through the supply chain. You've probably got somebody designing it, whether it's one of the big four, maybe OpenAI. Then you've got someone in mid-range who's maybe rebadging the white labeled product. And then you've got somebody who's a very small business, maybe a very small charity, who has absolutely no idea what's gone on at those other phases. And I mean, those kind of use cases it goes back to the point I made. You can't start to feel around the edges of risk until you find the use cases. And once you do have an idea what you want to use it for, these kind of no pain, no harm, no foul scenarios where you can work it through. I used to always want to start an engagement with a big client who wasn't quite sure where they stood with an incident scenario, because you start to surface who's got skin in the game and who really would put some weight behind it if something went wrong. And then you start to look at who's accountable, responsible, and who might make a difference. But I mean, that stuff's great. And I think we'll be able to circle right back to some of these points. I was going to move on. I was actually going to skip over to the micro next, and really just see how you are perceiving the impact on your very personal world. How are you seeing Gen AI cropping up with family, friends, with your own career? What do you think is happening in the jobs market? All that kind of stuff on this kind of quite personal level, if you're happy to talk about that. I mean, Mitch, I don't know. It's there's a bit of a you've got personal and professional colliding quite a lot at the moment, I'm finding.
Absolutely. And on a personal level, I'm very fortunate to be placed in so many different areas where I can see the benefits to a lot of people, and I can see the harm that also happens. There's a lot of people who have reached out to me over the past 2 years of different Gen AI models coming out that have pretty much come to me in true crisis at a personal level. So I'm going to start off a little bit more on the positives before I jump onto the negatives, just because, we're having a pretty happy conversation. Don't want to turn that mood too quickly. One of the happier things that I'm seeing is that a lot of people now have a system where they could bounce ideas off of. A lot of people really felt siloed for a long time about how am I going to figure this out and having to determine to figure it out on their own. Now they can actually bounce ideas off Gen AI. And it's really making a large difference whether they're writers, they're doing sales pitches or anything like that. It's really expanding it like that. A lot of people have come to me saying, Gen AI is going to take my job. I'm very worried about that. What do I do? And I tell everyone that just like a lot of things in life, generative AI is a tool for you to use. And if you can master that, you really position yourself in a better place in your career and in your life. There are small little things that even I do, like I've used an OpenAI API key to set up a little Signal bot so that I can message it on Signal and have conversations and just really random things and be like, hey, this email, is this grammatically correct? Is this syntax right? And it helps me out in that sense. So at a personal level, I'm using it to better myself in a lot of different ways. A little bit more on the negative side of things is I've heard a lot of people get some really bad mental health advice from the different generative AI models that they work with. And you brought up a really crucial point, which is that if you're going to rely on it, needs to be there during a crisis. So OpenAI having outages when someone's using a ChatGPT model as their therapist is a horrible situation because now that person's truly alone. There's a certain aspect to adding generative AI into the medical field that kind of fuels the dehumanization of a lot of experiences that really transpire over time. So I don't think I know a lot of people who would be fully comfortable not going to a doctor, but just having a doctor-based session, a medical session with just an AI system. A lot of people are like, no, I want to talk to someone face-to-face. I want it to be really there. In the worst case scenario, I've gotten way too many messages over the past years, and we move away from the tech side of things to really focus on the generative AI and images. So I think it's important on a personal level that people are really feeling the impact of deepfakes and how that's almost ruining people's lives when they're being used as adult content or anything like that. So I've had people from ages of 14 to 30, 40 years old reach out to me and say, I don't know how this happened, but someone is spreading fake nudes of me around to my networks and all these types of things. And on a personal level, you have to feel for these people that this is a threat to their reputation, it's a threat to their life, it's a threat to their mental health. So it's really impacting them because it's not for business, it's really just for malicious behavior. Someone does something as innocent as saying, hey, you're a really great person, I don't want to go on a date with you. And that person takes it as a personal snub. And then they say, you know what? I hate you. I'm going to take all your social media pictures. I'm going to throw them into deepfakes. I'm going to spread them to all your friends. I'm going to ruin your life. So I really look at the level of personal impact that's happening with generative AI more on the image and video side than the tech side, which is a lot of conversations really circle around LLMs and really on the tech side of things as it has a great impact for what's happening in the world. But on this image side of things, it's causing a lot of damage. I worry about my friends, my family, the people in my life who are so active on social media that it's simple for someone to say, I'm having a bad day, I'm going to take it out on you. And that's going to ruin their reputation and ruin what they can do in life because there are so many stories out there of people who are exploited, blackmailed for all these different types of things. And all they did was post a picture of themselves on the beach with their family. And that's where, on a personal level, that's where I really see the negative impacts, not just on the mental health from people using text-based systems as a contact in their life, but as well malicious behavior from people coming in and saying, I'm going to ruin your life with this generative AI model, because in terms of governance, there are no laws or anything that protect anyone in this sense. We are making some headway. There are some places in the world, I believe a couple states in the US, a few places across Europe where these use cases has happened, and we come back to don't wait for the bad headline or don't become the bad headline, but that's what's pushing these laws to come into effect. So that's on a personal level where I stand of generative AI impacting individuals as a whole.
Thanks. I mean, that's incredibly sobering. There's somebody who a security researcher who posts regularly on X and on LinkedIn about sextortion cases that have led to suicides amongst largely young people, where it follows the typical extortion route that, you know, it's not brand new, it's just accessibility and amplification that of things that are more convincing. And it feeds into another related point that I discussed with the sort of data protection crew that I speak to, which is it doesn't have to be a real fact about you to be personal information and harmful to be protected under data protection law. If something singles you out sufficiently that wrong fact can be attached to you and destroy your reputation, it's still personal information in the way it's being used. And people haven't even started to get across how to deal with that in practical terms to respond to it. We're seeing an awful lot more things that are feeling ransomware-ish, which is that once it happens, there are not a lot of options to deal with it. You just have to reach out to trustworthy people who understand this stuff to work through it in the least damaging and most rapid way possible. And that's not a great place. We need some more tools in the armory, it feels like, Mitch. I don't know if you agree. But I know that
absolutely.
So you got your hand
yeah. But just on your point real quick, Sarah, that this is where it's important to have that human aspect to come back, because you mentioned the sextortion cases which are plaguing the world right now. People, like the children who are committing suicide in these situations and the things that are happening, it's because they feel alone. There are some great organizations out there that are doing a lot of great work. There's Thorn, there's the National Protection of Children Task Force. There's all these different things that are making a difference to provide resources for these people. But these resources need to be more apparent so that when someone unfortunately might end up in this situation, they can actually say, I know who to talk to, I know who can help me, I'm not alone in this case. I'm very fortunate that people who've reached out to me, I've been able to help, and I've been able to say, you're not alone, this happens to a lot of people. Here's how you can protect yourself and feel not better, because it's something that scars you for your life, it's trauma inducing, but here's how here are the better steps of how you can deal with this to move on with your life and really push forward.
Thanks. We'll get those details and we'll share them afterwards as well, just in that spirit of making sure we spread those resources as widely as we can. Dennis.
Yes, so on this one, and I, Mitch, it's a massive problem, and I think it's one of those where I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I do feel I'm optimistic on these things. I think it's one of those problems that is going to get so bad that is actually going to help, because it's going to really question what is authenticity, right? If you think about it, the problem with those situations is that there's still a degree of authenticity. People still think it's true, right? And I think we have a problem of provenance today in the world, right? We have a problem of what is true, what is not true, what's facts, what not facts. I think that the deep fakes and the ability to easily create bad data is going to force us to have technologically and processes and cultural workflows that allow us to map provenance to data, right? And I saw this really good presentation where he said, when you start thinking about creativity, right? So start thinking about who creates it. The interesting thing is that if you follow the line, is like if you follow the line of data or follow the line of facts, when you hit a Gen AI model, you hit the black box, right? You can't go on the other side, right? So it's interesting that you can have a case where we should be better, we need better solutions, right? That allow us to know what is true, what is not true. From something as simple as who's calling you to then, is this data true or not, right? And then we need societal norms to start saying that's not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable to have that level of fakery, right, within our system because of everything that has, unless it's art, right? Unless it's another world, right? So I think it's going to get worse, but because it's so bad at that level, right? I think it should force society to deal with a problem that we have today, but we never really addressed it.
Absolutely. I agree with what you're saying, but there's an analogy I think of, which is the very simple, how big does the fire need to be before we call the fire department? And
well,
when that
right now, right? I think we need to be raising
absolutely, because there's a lot of these situations that happen in silos. So I've been part of the protection of children, anti-human trafficking space for a while now, and one of the things that I focus on is, well, not that I focus on, one of the things that I see in my network of contacts, my social medias, which are very depressing, I don't recommend anyone see them, but this is where I am fortunate to see how bad it can be. And I always live under the impression that if I'm seeing as much as I'm seeing, it's just a small fraction of it.
Yeah.
Because people get scared. And I know a lot of people who have reached out to me who have said things like, I'm not going to tell the police. I don't want this to turn into a thing. And this is where, well, it does need to turn into a thing, because these are the stories that are going to make a difference. So I do agree with you, Dennis, that it is going to get a lot worse, which will lead to it being better. But we can't ignore the victims that are going to exist in that worst phase. That's going to be a big problem for them, because that's
today, right?
100%. There have been some mainstream stories. There have been things like there was a famous Twitch streamer who was QT Cinderella. There's Taylor Swift, who had a bunch of things happening. These bigger stories are going to make that push for a better tomorrow. Yeah. But it is the little people of every day who are going to really fall to the side, which is one of those things that I hope on a personal level we can work towards, because the topic that you bring up, which is the disinformation and misinformation side of things, of what we can trust and what we can't trust, it's almost a people issue. And that's where it's going to take a lot of education for people to say, hey, I want to question this before I see it. Because, and I'm sure Nick will contribute to this part of it, disinformation and misinformation at its core is used for phishing emails. And it's taken us 20, 30 years to tell people, hey, maybe don't click that link in an email. And that's just in their corporate world. We're not even looking at the personal level of all these things that are happening. So the disinformation and misinformation side, which is a lot of what we do, not a lot, but it's a big chunk of what we do at the World Ethical Data Foundation, is really highlighting those points. Because disinformation, which is the malicious spread of information, which turns into misinformation of someone just spreading it without knowing any better and just being uneducated on the topic, this is going to become, it already is really bad, and it's used in war, it's used in society, and it's used in a lot of different ways. And that's where it's important to bring these up now and have these conversations like we're having here to really bring attention to that type of stuff. But I fear that how bad can it really get until those steps are taken? And that's what really concerns me in a lot of these different aspects.
Yeah. Nick, I mean, I think unforeseen consequences is what's claimed, and I think most of these consequences were foreseen. And I think, Dennis, to your point, the hype pushing the spread of this to the extent where the adverse outcomes have scaled to become visible enough to get attention isn't necessarily how it had to be. I think there's a realism about that, you know, just like in, people use the example of the combustion engine, that, you know, a few early bleeding edge tinkerers getting blown up wasn't going to get anyone desperately excited. But by the time they had thousands of vehicles on the road, somebody had to do something about it. But there was, I would argue, you probably had more time and more safety built in by the time it scaled that fast than this. I quite happy to be challenged on that. But Nick, I mean, what's your thinking?
Actually, sorry, I was going to discreetly look at LinkedIn. Mitch, you've pen tested before. We've discussed red team, and you've attacked things before.
Yes, I have, but the last time I did that, I broke it without fixing it. So I try to stay away from that these days.
You retired hurt, did you?
but just that. So like, I don't know you that well, Mitch, but you seem nice. Agreed. However, you have been a slightly overdramatic term. And I'm a former penetration tester and so on. We've been quite vicious towards organizations and systems for their benefit. And also we're the kind of people who, and especially, I mean, Denise, like none of these consequences, well, to be really specific about the language you use, Sarah, they are unforeseen, but they're not unforeseeable. Quite a lot of this is, did you not see that coming? The reason I'm sort of promoting wargaming as a practice is just, if you stop and think about this, and if you get into the mind, especially if you get into the mindset of attackers, or in that more general red teaming sense, just think like an attacker for an afternoon. The way people's eyes light up when you say all those criminal thoughts you have, and maybe you suppress, and maybe it's a past life you've left behind or whatever. Let all that out, and it's for the benefit of your organization. So much of what's happened is so predictable and is exact, and is the kind of thing that organizations can guard against, and the kind of thing that sort of, especially with the speed of the legal system, that governments should be able to get ahead of, rather than just being sort of constantly surprised by something that's relatively obvious and then catching up over a period of sort of a year or two. Meanwhile, sort of the technology is just racing ahead. So I think for me, I mean, the main point to make, unfortunately, to looking at my notes, is I would disagree with the optimism of Denise and Mitch, in that I think there will just be a new normal of things being worse, and a new normal of sort of truth being worth less. And I'm sort of thinking back to postmodernism I studied like 30 years ago at college, is just how the information space and the value of data becomes different in those kind of environments. And it might be, and again, this is like a what's your strategy type question, is do you adapt to that? Do you see that as so likely that you have to have a strategy, you have to have a plan for what if everything stays on fire? I really like the analogy you used, Mitch, is just, yeah, everything's on fire now. You can wish for the fire service as much as you like, or you can figure out how you're going to avoid being flammable, how you're gonna what's your fireproof suit, or do you just get used to it? I think those are the sort of difficult questions organizations need to be asking themselves.
I think that's fascinating, Nick, and it did very cynically what I thought when you said what do you need to need to have a fire suit. My father did national service, which is quite topical in the UK at the moment, and he was a fireman on an aircraft carrier, and the reason and what he did for fire suppression is he took 2 layers of his suit and he poured asbestos powder into it to replenish the fire retardantness. So yeah, there's also a trying to avoid the cure being worse than the illness element to this as well. And for that, I'm just sort of going to segue on to the conversation about the macro picture, is that there's, in order to monitor for the gains and the uplift, in order to gain the clean labeled structured data that's going to give us the incredible insights into things that I think we are all seeing benefit from, things like visualizing in incredible number of scenarios around potential climate change, or potentially resilient crops, or potentially how to balance renewable and non-renewable fuel in a constructive way and work out how to more intelligently use the power grid. Things in medicine where, you know, I have had an historical situation where I looked at all the unstructured data that was accumulating in patient forums where doctors didn't have time to unpick the pieces of self-driven research and first-hand reporting of symptoms and things. You had some incredibly well-motivated people, whether it be patients or carriers, gathering enormous quantities of rich information globally that wasn't part of what a system under pressure could put together and actually sift through. And I had thoughts about how could we use intelligent data analysis techniques to pull out value, but doing it in a respectful way that didn't ride roughshod over the rights of the people who volunteered that information. So that kind of speaks to a lot of the big challenges we've got here. I think just pulling round to some positive elements of this again, I think the first thing that we have to do is create spaces where people can rapidly feel the edges of what they're looking at and planning to do, where they can get a really realistic idea. I mean, we haven't to this point defined what we mean by Gen AI as well. I'm very aware of that. And I know when we were preparing, we were talking about how do you differentiate Gen AI from other types of AI, whether it be predictive models or CNNs and that kind of thing, convolutional neural networks. Obviously you had Jan LeCun and Elon Musk having quite an active disagreement on Twitter, on X, not long ago, and it obviously one of the biggest, most active applications of something that Jan LeCun worked on was the optical recognition that allows postcode or zip code recognition to work at rapid scale for mail distribution, and we forget those things are out there and happening. one side of image recognition is creating the ability to recognize potentially missed positives in medical diagnosis. Another side is refining facial recognition with some perhaps unhelpful definitions of emotions that you can and intent that you can assign to people based on characteristics of how they move or speak or keywords they use. So those are the kind of things on the macro level I'm thinking about. How do we manage to retain human agency rather than decide that anything is fair game because there's a greater good in future that we've decided outbalances what could go wrong? How do we make surfacing a clearer picture of risk exposure and what we can do about it easier so it can combat the rapidity of movement that everyone's after?
So if I could chip in, I think explainability and provenance are the key of all of that. And to be fair, we always had this problem in technology, right? But it never felt that big. And so we got away with it, right? But I feel that we get into a world where a lot of stuff can be created in a certain way that we don't know how it gets created. And I think we need to get to the other side where we validly question the outcomes and demand explainability and demand provenance of how that decision was arrived, how that image was created, how that content exists, right? And then clearly distinguish, right, the two worlds, right? And the reason, kind of, Nick, why I'm optimistic on this is because A, I don't think it can get much worse than it is at the moment, that information, but also because in society, what we do is when the problem occurs, we do change, right? You know, I think what's important is to make sure that when we do change, the good side of the force has a good plan. So this doesn't get, again, twisted in the whole commercial models and the power plays that had happened before. I think it's important that as we find solutions for this, we don't make the mistakes we did with social media, for example, and we don't make the mistakes we did making most of the internet to be driven by advertising, right? Those are things that happen just because some individuals, some companies were at the right place at the right time and drove that. I think the real opportunity here is to make this a lot more human and to allow us to really challenge the provenance of data and the provenance of how things work, which leads to explainability, leads to simple solutions, leads to lack of black boxiness, right? Because by definition, a black box is something you don't understand, right? How it works. And we should not allow, like, we wouldn't allow, in a way, us to fly on a plane, right? That nobody knows how it works, right? But I think at the moment what happens, even going, you know, Mitch, to what you mentioned, I think there's sometimes this situation where the problem is quite big, but because nobody added up all of that, it doesn't feel that big because you just see the individuals. I sometimes used to say this to members of my team, was there's always a number of individuals that have the curse of being the person that do a lot for a lot of people, and everybody's pissed off with that person because everybody thinks that person doesn't work hard enough. But that person does 10-minute jobs, 20-minute jobs, who the others think are simple, but it adds up very fast, right? So they are in a worst case scenario, right? And I think some of the situations are like that. We have a lot of those things. It's just that you don't add up, right? So you don't feel how bad it is. And just a final thought here, I think what excites me on this is that not only we have a technology that's going to cause a lot of problem, but I think we have a technology that used correctly can actually help us to solve the problem. Because for me, what I like about Gen AI is not the ability to create content, which is where the problems exist, is its ability to understand content, understand complexity, right? Understand mappings, understand provenance in the ways that we couldn't before. That's why I'm optimistic, because in the past, all of that required coding, all of that required technology, all of that required more complexity, which is, you know, wide in scale, where we now, for the first time, have a bit of technology that can actually understand context, understand data. What you want is actually models that don't bring any content. We give the content, we give the structure, we give the data, we give the parameters, and they provide the analysis, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, you use then 3 or 4 models in parallel with a couple of others to verify, and the ideal situation is that becomes code. So again, it's about deterministic and provenance and highly explainable paths, right, in the mix.
So we need to understand the edges of the probabilistic, so we know where to add the deterministic. I think a lot of people are struggling with that right now.
Yeah.
But guys, I'm conscious of time as well, but I'd really like to hear what you feel could be done to tackle these macro challenges to make the mid-range and micro more handleable. And also just want to pull it back to something very practical. Do you have one or maybe two things that people can go and read, see, do, or watch that might damp down some of this overwhelm that you'd like to share with everyone? And I can include it in resources afterwards. So if I was going to go to you, Nick, first, and then to you, Mitch.
Okay. Resources, I don't know. I don't know at the moment. There's so much going on.
So
Overwhelm
much,
is a great point. I shall sneakily and very quickly, looking at the time, come up with or rather read out the 4-point plan I've just come up with. First point is, as Denise has demonstrated, is engage with the tech. A lot of people like, you're unhappy with AI, so you just reject it completely. I think the environmental effects of people using AI are so minimal per person. You want the people who don't like what it's doing or see how it's harming careers to actively engage with it and get into those discussions rather than just ignore it and hoping it goes away. Because even if it's a bubble, parts of it are going to stick around. Secondly, communities like this is talk to other people, talk to people who kind of agree with you enough about bits of it, so that there are groups of people saying this is what we want to see, rather than just very wealthy, very technological leaders basically exploiting everybody else. Thirdly, create demonstrable and profitable examples of positive use. So you can say, look, we can use this and it can work, and yet we don't have to steal all this information from the internet. That's, without consent, and all the issues around that. And fourthly is how you and Denise started, Sarah, to me, is how people see the qualities of an AI business as differentiators that I mean, there's some of the now, the whole we will not use your data to train our AI, that kind of thing.
People like Fairly Trained are working on stuff.
Sarah, quickly, I need to jump to the other section. I'll drop you a note. I'll make you the host, and then you can just end. You guys can continue.
I saw that. Thanks, Dennis. I appreciate that. It'll probably be a couple of minutes, and I'd like to just tie up. Thank you. So what about you, Mitch?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of resources, I find myself in, being a part of the World Ethical Data Foundation. I've been very lucky to see what goes on the back end of a lot of different things. And I'm very excited that I still go back. We have a live event that we put on 2 years ago. There's going to be another one this year. There are about 4 talks that come to mind that really highlight not specifically Gen AI, but AI as a whole, which then touches upon the Gen AI side of things. We had a talk last year, and I have them open right here so I get the titles right. There's AI ethics from principles to practice. What we spoke about is that your practice becomes your policies, and these principles that help establish those practices make a big difference. That was by Francesca Rossi. We have trustworthy AI. It was a conversation on people, power, and culture, which was an entire panel of some really smart individuals. Additionally, there was operationalizing trustworthy AI and data ethics, and this was through a financial technology lens. That was a great panel that we had. And then there was also a really fun one, which was the era of AI creativity, which we touched on a little bit. So these 4 talks that were at the 2022 event, I find myself going back to and watching and really learning from these experts who speak about these different types of things as a resource of how I can approach stuff. On a day-to-day level of what I do in terms of how I approach these Gen AI-based systems and everything, I try to remove myself and the situation as to be as little siloed as possible. You really want these things to be done in a broader light with a bigger team. Nick, what he does with the wargaming, I think is a fantastic way of going about it. We have tabletop exercises that we do on the VAR side, and really just ensuring that you are having the conversations with people outside of the scope of what you're doing who bring a different perspective, who have different ideas. Something that Nick said earlier that really resonated with me is that when we're doing red teaming or when I'm doing dark web reconnaissance, it is our job to think like a criminal, not to be a criminal, I always clarify that, but to think like a criminal. And that's where you want these additional perspectives that are really able to push the needle forward so that you can make these changes to your Gen AI systems, to your organizations, or even to yourself in that micro, mid-range, macro to make the differences you need for all these different things. So in terms of resources, I'll share you the link so you can share those videos with everybody. But just more on that is just try to get as many perspectives to help influence what you're doing at a larger level is what I would say.
You know, somebody might think we planned this because that segues brilliantly into what I wanted to say, which is the first one is that you have to bring people into the room, as many different kinds of people into the room as you can. Something that's feeding some of the work that's happening that I'm doing with the World Ethical Data Forum is actually potentially using generative AI to help people visualize what other people might say or the impacts there might be on other people than they perhaps easily visualize in the moment when they're asked to fill in a risk or impact assessment, because we stare at those things as a blank page and it's within our sphere of we're crunching to get to the next deliverable, and somebody's asking us to articulate and identify risks in a scenario that we may never have lived in, talked about, thought about. So we need to bring those other people to the table. The other thing is that triage piece, that sort of segmenting up controls that look like they might be a good idea into things that are knowable now versus knowable later, not knowable at all, partially knowable. If you're just taking somebody's word for all the guardrails that might be in place, like some of us do when we send off a vendor questionnaire, if we've got an awful lot of them to do, then it can leave an awful big gap. And I think having a very honest conversation about what we can know for some certainty, you can't manage any risks that you're just not aware of, that you're just not got any certainty about. And anything that you're not certain about, it pushes into the post-market space. Anything that you're not certain about when you release it is a risk that you've transferred to the consumer or a downstream business that's using your solution. And that's not getting tackled right now. Everything has been thrown over the fence, and we're very aware that things like ChatGPT were released even without OpenAI board being aware that it was necessarily going to be pushed out. So we've been doing a lot of sucking it and seeing as a global population at the moment. And there are portions of the world with far more capability, access and means to get across that than other parts of the world. And that's, again, something that we're trying to improve with the World Ethical Data Forum. We've got a lot of activity going on in places where AI is maybe happening to them more than with them, and seeing if we can share some of those resources we've got. But just those are the couple of things I wanted to say, but I've got a couple of papers I'm going to add from people like Luciana Floridi, who's been very good at that juncture between talking about ethics and actually actionably doing something about it as part of governance programs. And I'll share the slides, as I said, and I'll add some other things that the guys have talked about. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. This has brought me other perspectives and shape around it. And I'd love to carry this on another time if we could. But for now, just thank you. That's been brilliant. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah, for bringing us together. It's been a great chat.
Pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to stop recording on this, so we'll have to work that out. Alona, are you still on the call? There we are. I've got it. I think they changed the menu on Zoom, and I absolutely cannot find what I need anymore very easily. But I hear that in
so many calls. It's like, where's the option, or which of the many menus?
Hi, Jack. Oh dear. Yeah, so I'm gonna let you guys go because it's been a long day. But yeah, if you think of anything, please ping me and I'll just add it onto the other stuff.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Really